I've always been jealous of those cookie decorating videos where the piping comes out just perfect and the designs are so clean and beautiful. As someone whose artistic talent is below average, I could just never see myself being able to pull off something so nice. But I feel like I'd be cheating myself if I didn't at least try, so I baked and iced 500 cookies in an effort to boost my skills. Here's what I learned. I started by figuring out which cookie recipe to use because if I'm gonna make 500 of something, I want it to taste good. I did a whole side-by-side comparison of the top sugar cookies online, and you can find that video here. Then I got to icing. I decided a nice white background would be a good place to start. Right away, I realized there were some issues I would need to work on. First, I'm apparently incapable of drawing a circle. I watched a few videos to get some tips, but a lot of those didn't end up applying to cookie decorating. I even hit up my friends for a couple suggestions, and while a lazy Susan was a good idea, it didn't really make that much of a difference, and it was kind of a pain in the ass. Honestly, I did get a little bit better at this, but I didn't end up mastering the skill over the course of the 500 cookies. Second, my outline was visible after I did the flood. See, when you're decorating cookies, you usually use two consistencies. A more stiff consistency is used for the border or the outline. Then a thinner consistency is used to fill out or flood the area that's outlined. Since all the videos online are people who are expert at this, I've never actually seen this problem and didn't even realize it existed. The flood and the outline don't just melt together. The flood is actually supposed to go on top of the outline, not just inside it. Getting this right without allowing the flood to overflow was a challenge, and while I was really able to improve in this on the decorating phase, as you'll see, for whatever reason I had a hard time with it in the background. So in the last 100 or so cookies, I ended up using a medium consistency, which was between a border and a flood consistency, and used that for both. Storage also ended up being an issue. Looking for a place to let the cookies dry overnight, I ended up putting them in the oven, but that turned out to be not such a great idea. So this morning I woke up and got right to baking cookies. Preheated the oven, started rolling out the dough. And when I went to start putting cookies in the oven, I remembered that I was letting the cookies from last night dry the icing in the oven, and absolute catastrophe. Fortunately, my first cookie I left in this tray outside of the oven, so I have that. With the oven out, I needed to find another solution to storage. All the cookies have to be able to lie flat in a single layer so they don't get messed up, and they need to be in a place where they're not vulnerable to predators. I ended up getting a bunch of disposable trays and covering them with aluminum foil. Don't worry, I'm going to clean and reuse these trays for something else. The final and most stubborn problem with the background icing was bubbles. Even if I got a perfectly smooth finish on the icing, after letting it sit for a couple of minutes, these little bubbles would pop up. It kind of looks like the cookies have pimples. Even after consulting with the cookie decorating community on Reddit, there never seemed to be one clear answer on how to prevent this. Essentially, anything you can do to prevent air from getting into the icing or to let air escape the icing before you pipe is good. Though the consensus is you'll never actually be able to get all the bubbles out of your royal icing. Here are some things that I tried, starting with the least effective and ending with the most effective. Changing the consistency of the flood icing. Thinner or thicker, this didn't really seem to affect anything either way. Shaking or tapping the cookie also didn't really seem to do anything. Popping bubbles with a scribe tool. While this did help with some of the bubbles that I popped, eventually there would be other smaller bubbles that popped up, and when I went to pop those, the top of the icing had already dried, so I just ended up messing up the cookie. The windmill method. The theory is that twirling the piping bag around like a helicopter will force the icing to the front of the piping bag and the air to the back of the piping bag. I experimented with this several times and it did seem to help a little bit, but it was not the end-all be-all solution. Lowering the mixing time and the mixing speed on my stand mixer actually did help. The faster the mix and the longer the mix, the more air that gets worked into the icing. So minimizing both of those factors did help a bit. I ended up going from a liquid egg white base to a meringue powder base. Egg whites can foam up pretty easily, foam means bubbles, bubbles means air, you get where this is going. So when I went on my bubble defeating journey, I ended up changing recipes from a very basic one to the one that the lady from Little Cookie Co uses. I mean, why not emulate success, right? That recipe also used white food coloring to brighten up the icing, which is why my backgrounds went from a translucent ivory kind of color to a bright white. The most effective factor that I found in bubble removal was time. Both after you mixed flood consistency and after you put the icing in the piping bag, a resting time of 20 to 30 minutes would bring a lot of bubbles to the surface. Again, this method wasn't perfect, but it seemed to be the most effective method of anything that I tried. So with the combination of the most effective techniques, I was able to minimize bubbles and finish up my backgrounds. Then I moved on to decoration. I started by doing an outline for the trees, but my outline consistency was a little bit too loose, and I cut the tip of the piping bag a little too wide. This resulted in an outline that was way too thick and didn't hold its shape at all. And when I tried to flood the outline of those cookies, well. All right, another chapter in the cookie saga. I'm started with the Christmas trees. They look like a children did it, but you know, I mean, it's pretty much what I was expecting. What I wasn't expecting, I don't know how I forgot this lesson, but the flood doesn't just melt into the outline, and so I did all these outlines, and then I started to flood the cookies, and of course they look like this. They look like this ridiculous, globby, insane thing. So these are all pretty much ruined. So then I tried to go back to that medium consistency and use it for the flood and the outline, like I did with some of the background, but that just does not work for a shape with sharp edges like this tree. So I finally resigned myself to the fact that I was gonna have to learn how to outline and flood properly. I did a little overcorrection in stiffening up my outline consistency, and I ended up blowing a bag out. But after that, I thinned it out just a little bit, I cut the tip just a little wider, and it was perfect. And once I got to flooding, I was finally able to figure out how to cover the outline, which was largely thanks to the use of this little scribe tool. I realized there was a decent amount of manipulation you could do with the icing to get it to the shape that you want. After that initial batch, I was feeling pretty confident, and I wanted to get a little more fancy. So instead of flooding the whole tree at once, I only flooded the top and the bottom part. Then I let those dry, and I flooded the middle part. This resulted in 3 distinct sections that made up the tree, which I think made it look nicer. The one consistent problem with this design was the top section. You can see a bunch of places where there's a hole or the icing is actually caved in on itself. In the cookie world, that's called cratering. And one way to combat that is to add a little bit of outline icing in the smaller areas of your design. This is supposed to prop up and reinforce the flood. Again, that method wasn't perfect, but it definitely helped. After getting a decent amount of practice with the sectioned off method, I decided I wanted to step up my game again with a little accent at the bottom of each section. I mixed up a darker green color and added it to the icing while it was still wet. Then I dragged my scribe tool through to make a neat little design. When it dries, the 2 colors are on the same plane, which looks nice. This is called a wet on wet technique. After making a good number of those, I decided that this cookie still needs a little bit more going on. So that's when I decided to add some little ornaments and a pot at the bottom of the tree. A final lesson here is that if this decoration is too stiff, it's really hard to knock down those little peaks that form when you pull off the piping bag. So if you go a little bit looser, they'll kind of round themselves out. And with those final details, that was the end of my cookie journey. You can see that while there's still a ton of room for refinement, all the time and practice that went into this project showed a dramatic improvement. If you're a cookie expert and you're watching this, please chime in and let me know what I'm still doing wrong. Or you can just make fun of me, that's fine too. In any case, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.